Hi, today we've got Chris, Head of Partnerships at the Future Forest Company. For those who don't know, the Future Forest Company are somewhat a hugely growing company in the carbon offset space. Today, Chris is going to be telling us a little bit more about what they're doing in that carbon offset space, how they're doing it, and abolishing some of the preconceptions that people may have or may have heard in regards to carbon offset. So good morning, Chris. Great to have you on here.
Hi, Charles. Good to be on. Thanks for the introduction.
So do you mind giving us and listeners wise a little bit more clarity on what the Future Forest Company are doing and a little bit maybe on the history and where they've come from?
Yeah, definitely. So Future Forest Company, we're a UK-based carbon removal, like an environmental company with our objective. If you go on our website, there's a few kind of expletives that explain our mission, but it's really to sequester as much carbon from the atmosphere as possible, and we're doing that by reforesting large swathes of the UK at scale. So we're buying old kind of degraded farmland to plant as many trees as possible. So the aim is to plant 50 million trees by 2025, and we're making sure that, as the saying goes, it's always the right tree in the right place. So we put reforestation plans in place that get approval, so it's the right tree mix in highlands, lowlands. So trying to create legacy forests and create the right habitat. So it's a balance between the environmental side, the kind of the habitat side of things, and drawing down as much carbon as possible from those forests. And we really complement the forests with some other carbon removal approaches. So we are starting to implement biochar at scale, and also enhanced weathering. So enhanced weathering is, for example, the rock mineralization process using basalt rock, which captures carbon through rainfall. So when the rain hits the surface area of the basalt rock, carbon is then mineralized through a reaction with the surface of the rock. So we're implementing that at scale, and we're doing some tests at the moment where we're breaking up the basalt rock, spreading that on the land to try and accelerate the sequestration of the carbon through that process. So that's the enhanced part of the weathering process. And then also we've got some peatland on some of our land. So up in Scotland, there's huge swathes of peatland that we're looking to restore. So all that we do is focused on nature-based carbon removal activities. So we're UK based at the moment, but looking to also move into the US to really implement this at scale wherever we can find suitable land. So that's kind of the future forest in a nutshell.
Nice. And if things work out well with the trials then for the Bastog Rock, is that going to be a case of that's going to be in somewhat adopted by farmers then to spread on farmland? What's the plans to really scale it and hopefully make a dent in the carbon emissions conversion there?
So the potential is absolutely huge. What we're doing at the moment are tests to make sure that there's no adverse effects on either the soil health when you're applying essentially rock that doesn't currently exist in the soil in high volumes. So we're testing that, any adverse effects on the soil health, and also any adverse effects on through surface runoff and through into the water systems nearby. So those are the tests that we're doing at the moment to make sure that there's no negative impact on the ecosystem. But then, assuming that everything is then given the all clear, we'll be looking to apply that at scale on all the land that we own. So we're looking to, we already own enough land in the UK to plant, I think it's 2 million trees now. We're looking to, as I said, to be able to plant 50 million trees. So we'll be applying that at scale across our land. And then the potential is to then apply that across farmland and any land where it's suitable, really. So farmland, existing forests, where there's a kind of a chance for absorption and the mineralization process to take place. So provided that the tests go well, there's a chance to really to apply it at scale and sequester a huge amount of carbon.
Nice. And it's a hugely ambitious target, isn't it? 50 million trees. In terms of how you find the curvature and growth of the business so far, when was the business incorporated? When did the whole plot to restore farmland and I suppose really make an adaptation, when did it all start?
So Jim Mann, our CEO and co-founder of the Future Forest, Actually, kind of the first guise of the company was the birch syrup company. So Jim had kind of sought to try and understand how he could make forests profitable, how forests can be financially sustainable, and was looking at birch syrup as a way of essentially monetizing forests. So we were taking syrup from birch trees, as the name would suggest, and selling that. So it's kind of that still exists, and we've still got clients where we sell it into bars and restaurants. So that was the first step of the company. But then through that kind of exploration phase, we kind of understood that, okay, there is a much bigger potential market here through the kind of the carbon offset market to create healthy forests, to plant healthy forests in the UK on land that we own, so that we can guarantee the permanence of the trees, which is a huge factor when it comes into reforestation. You need to be able to essentially guarantee that those trees are going to be there for 100 years or for many years into the future. So we started creating a model that led us towards the Future Forest Company, which really came into fruition late 2019, early 2020. The Future Forest Company came into its current form, and we bought our first site at Broadacley, just west of Glasgow. I think it was before I joined the company, but that was kind of late 2019 into 2020 when we started reforesting Broadacley as a site. We've got about 20 to 25,000 trees there, and what we're trying to do is just prove the model on a small scale, and then through Broadacley we've started to prove the model from a reforestation perspective, making sure that we register all the trees with the Woodland Carbon Code, which is the UK's forestry body and kind of reforestation carbon credit body. And now we're looking just to scale quickly, but in a controlled manner. So we've got a financial model that allows us to scale and get investment.
Nice. And with that, I touched on it in the introduction about some people's preconceptions. I think more cowboy outfits potentially that they may have heard of in the past, and how some people are using carbon offset as a face for just maybe more of a scam related emphasis than anything. But I'm sure you've heard of them as well, Chris. But what is the Future Forest Company doing that's different? How are you ensuring companies that their money is actually going to a beneficial cause, something which is making a difference?
Yeah, so I guess when you're looking at the carbon offset market, there's two big challenges that have been around over the last couple of decades when it comes to carbon offsets, that have created a lot of fear or doubt in people's mind in the public, and one of which is companies who are just essentially throwing money at carbon offsets as a cheaper way to kind of wipe their slate clean and to be guilt-free. And the big challenge there is that if you think of the bathtub analogy of the atmosphere, and what we need to be doing, we need to be turning the tap off to making sure that we're reducing the amount of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere, and also removing CO2 from the bath. So we need to be putting the plug on the bath, and essentially just by throwing money at credits and not decarbonizing. And decarbonizing is the way that companies look at all their activities and say, okay, we're polluting too much. We need to be flying less. We need to be changing our energy sources. We need to be doing all this stuff to reduce that footprint, and then we can offset at the bottom. That's the right way for companies to be approaching carbon offsetting, because in that sense, by doing that, you're turning the tap off of the bath, so the water is staying still, and we're also through offsetting, through investing in projects like ourselves where we're planting trees, or there's other kind of carbon removal approaches, you're reducing that surface area of or you're reducing the amount of water in that bath, so you're bringing it down at a quicker rate than you're filling it up. Whereas the big challenge is that if people are just keeping that tap on, then we're not going to get where we need to get. So that's a big issue with carbon offsetting up to this stage. There are companies, or there's no kind of, because a lot of it is voluntary, there's no one enforcing companies to reduce their footprint whilst they offset. So that's kind of challenge number one, and a lot of that's been going on, and we should see changes towards the end of this year that change kind of what net zero means, and whether companies to be net zero have to show that they are decarbonizing at a specific rate. And that would be, from our perspective, that would be a positive result of the discussions that are going on. So that's kind of issue number one. And issue number two is around our projects that are creating carbon offsets or carbon credits. Are they doing what they say they're doing? And again, this is another kind of solid reason why people are kind of in doubt about whether carbon offsetting in general is a good thing. And it's a real shame, because carbon offsetting, when done properly, is invaluable, and it's going to be a huge part of our kind of survival as a planet and way of countering climate change. And as it is, there's a lot of projects globally and that have been coming up in the last kind of 20-25 years where maybe there hasn't been the transparency, and the trees that have been planted, there hasn't been the guarantee the trees are doing what they say they're doing when it comes to carbon avoidance projects. Maybe the baseline that they're looking at hasn't been the right baseline for the measuring, for the future measuring kind of year on year. So yeah, there are definitely question marks over projects that have been around up to this point. But what we're hoping to see a much greater transparency and the bar raised in terms of verification processes and accreditation globally, because there's projects that have been verified and the verification bodies are in place to say, look, that project has done what it said it's been done, but then there's been further investigation that shows that it hasn't. So we're hoping that the standard will be brought up so that there'll be less of these rogue projects globally, so that people can trust again in a verification standard, because as a business, you should be able to trust a seal of approval that is given on a carbon project. You shouldn't have to really go and do your additional research and go to the forest yourself. If you're a business, you're doing lots of other stuff, you should be able to trust in that seal of approval. Whereas up to now, it's been shown that even with recent research, and the airlines have been using offset projects which have been kind of carbon avoidance through reforestation, through prevention of deforestation, where the baseline of that deforestation was not accurate. So yeah, your people are right to be cautious and wary of carbon offsetting, and people need to do their research to make sure that the projects they're investing in are doing what they're saying they're doing, but they shouldn't be shying away from carbon offsetting in general. And I guess as a project, we want to have full transparency over what we're doing. So we're UK based, and we welcome everyone to come up and visit our forests. So from a reforestation perspective, we own the land, we own everywhere that we plant our trees on. We record detailed data on every tree that we plant. So we're recording the species, geolocation, tree grid reference of every single tree that we plant from a reforestation perspective, so that we can work with, at the moment, the Woodland Carbon Code and other verification bodies that come that are brought into the UK from a reforestation perspective over future years. So we've got all that data so that we know that tree was when it was planted, and how much carbon has been sequestered, so the above ground biomass can be measured of those trees over the future years. And yeah, we're working with verification bodies for our other offset, for other carbon removal techniques. So the biochar, we're going to be working with the Puro Earth methodology and enhanced weathering. Given there's no verification body at the moment, we're working with leading scientists to really understand what is the carbon drawdown, how much carbon is captured by X amount of basalt rock. So yeah, we're being fully transparent and trying to gather as much data so that we make sure that the carbon that we say is being removed is removed. It's only ever removed and given as offsets once, or carbon removals once. So we can hope to dispel a lot of the myths and the fears around the market.
Yeah, I think you touched on a few good points there, if I'm honest, Chris. So, I think business in general, I think transparency is key, isn't it? No matter what you're doing in what industry, but especially when people are putting their faith in you as a business to business agreement, then transparency in what you're doing is a massive factor. And I think what probably helps is, you mentioned that, am I right in saying that all of your projects at the moment are very much UK based? So you've got that close to home factor. And are all of the projects that you're working with in terms of that that carbon offset and reversing, what's been generated. Is everything then sort of done within the Future Forest Company, or are you third partying some of the factors there?
Yeah, so everything is being done internally. So it's all based around the land that we acquire. So as I said, we're buying kind of old bits of farmland from the commercial market, and planting the trees on our land. So those, if you think of the bathtub analogy, those trees are being planted, and gradually over time, those trees are going to be sucking out the water from the kind of the CO2 from that bathtub, gradually decreasing. And with trees, kind of, we've touched on this before when we've spoken, there is a curve of these trees. So you need to plant a lot of trees now, but those trees really won't be removing a lot of carbon from the atmosphere until maybe years 10 through to years 25 of their growth, depending on the species. But it's vital to be planting those trees now, not only from a carbon drawdown perspective, but also if the trees are planted in the right way, and there's the right kind of silvicultural approach, the biodiversity value of those trees to be restoring habitats is equally vital to the kind of equally important as the kind of the carbon benefits of that. And there's a lot of that being touched on at the moment, that trees alone aren't the solution, but they're part of the bigger solution, and they play a really vital role in kind of the habitat restoration. And then as the enhanced weathering that we're doing is all on at the moment, it's all on our land. So we're on Mull, we've got kind of a source of Bastog Rock from a local quarry, and biochars are in. We've got our first biochar pyrolysis machine on Mull, and we're looking to get that up and running, and then replicate that across our other sites. And then peatland, when we're restoring peatland, it's always on our site. So there's peatland that's degraded across a lot of Scotland that is just essentially releasing carbon into the atmosphere all the time. So what essentially for peatland restoration, you just need to block up the drains, because over the past few decades people have been draining peatland to be able to plant on it or farm on it, and peatland is a carbon sink. So there's huge amounts of carbon trapped in this peatland, whereas because of the poor condition of the peatland, it's just being released into the atmosphere. So our first mission when we take on a lot of these sites is to understand how can we block reflood the peatland so that the carbon isn't draining. But it's all on our site, so there's no really kind of third party activity to answer your question.
Nice. It keeps that whole close to home factor, doesn't it? Especially sort of local love local, don't they? So you even look at a scale down factor within village shops, and people can either go 15 minutes 20 minutes up the road, or they can look into their village shop for all the necessities. And I think it's probably a similar case with the carbon offset factor, is if it is close to home, if you can see it, if you're actually somewhat experiencing a physical benefit of it, whether it's just knowing that a few hours away there's you're contributing to this bigger factor, which is either, I think it even comes down to that habitat, doesn't it? So trees, they look great, you've got the aesthetics. You mentioned there that looking at science, they're probably not the best in terms of carbon regeneration and the carbon drawdown, but you look at the wider factor of it and the wider scale, and I think it's definitely something which needs to be implemented as I suppose as a race, we continue to deforest for more farmland, etc. So it's really that offset against that as well. And you mentioned before that now there's more regulatory standards potentially coming in with carbon zero and net zero, and I'm fairly aware that the two are very different things, but I'm sure most people listening often think it's two of the same. So do you mind giving me a little bit of expansion in terms of the differences between net zero and carbon zero?
So a lot of it will depend on what you're measuring from your business's offset. So you've got scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and a lot of businesses will work with a consultant to really understand where the different footprint sits within their business, whether it's their office, or then you're looking more towards their supply chain, so stuff that isn't directly, it's not within the business's operations, but say you're buying some material from a factory you don't own. Do you then include those in your offset? So it really depends on where you set that measuring post, and there's a lot of debate that's going on this year to look to potentially, or hopefully, confirm what net zero really means, so that a company who's making a net zero statement should be then aligned with science-based targets, which are aligned with the Paris Agreement, because at the moment we've got a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, making different statements. And I think globally, if we're going to make statements as businesses, we need to make sure these statements align with what the planet needs for recovery. There's no point in people making statements for 2070 where if we don't reduce by 2030 or 2040, whatever the science-based targets say, whatever the Paris Agreement says, we'll have missed the boat. There's no point in AIM making targets for 2070 if that doesn't line up with what the planet needs. So yeah, from at the end of COP, or we're hoping that by COP in Glasgow later this year, there will be kind of a set standard for what net zero means. And there's a lot of debate at the moment around whether companies, if they're going to make a net zero statement, have to prove that they are also decarbonising, which I think personally is a huge piece of the puzzle there. We can't have companies who are saying that they're net zero and kind of wiping their hands, and they've just spent a lot of money on carbon offsets, but they haven't reduced their footprint, because they get again back to that bathtub analogy. That bathtub is going to be flowing over the top if we don't turn off the tap, or at least kind of stem the flow of water and be removing more than what is going in. So I think that'll be the key for what we're going to see this year is what does net zero mean? A lot of it is still the voluntary market, so companies don't have to be aligning with anything at all if they don't want to, but we're going to see hopefully a move towards kind of the publicity side, the kind of the pressure, whether it's from shareholders or customers and future customers, making that demand of companies that they're investing in or they're purchasing from, making that net zero statement. And then that net zero statement has to be aligned globally with what's going to make the changes that we need as a planet.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think in the world we live in, where everything is so data driven, and the tech is there in order to really generate the figures required from that whole supply chain, and ultimately work out what carbon's been generated from that start to end process, then having some sort of regulatory standard involved which says actually you only need to calculate from here to here, and ultimately they know where they're at, they can monitor that. Because at the moment, like you said, rightly or wrongly, some companies might be classing themselves as carbon zero, and they might be carbon zero, but they're maybe only doing the bare minimum in order to confirm themselves as doing so. You look at some of the work we do here, we're only running minimum servers, a few laptops, etc. And we could probably quite easily, through some form of carbon offset, class ourselves as carbon zero, but there's a whole wider factor. And although most people here either walk, cycle, or run to work, you don't factor in the one or two that might have to drive in order to then walk, run, or cycle to work. So that wider end-to-end process definitely needs to be brought in. And with that, do you think then, hopefully these standards are going to be in play by tail end of this year, and hopefully for the start of 2022, we've got something to work towards?
Yeah, hopefully. And we're hoping that they'll be presented at COP later this year, where it'll be a really clear guidelines. It'll hopefully get rid of a lot of the grey areas for companies, especially when you're looking at scope 3, which, touching on what you just said there, should you as a company have to cover for the commute of your employees? Is that part of your remit in terms of your net zero aims? That shouldn't be, in my view, that shouldn't be left to a grey area. I think your business's existence relies upon your employees getting to work. So that should be, if your business didn't exist, that employee wouldn't be going to work. So that's part of your footprint. So I think it's tough for business owners because there are those grey areas, and offsetting it's a minefield. There's a lot of information about them. What's the right thing? What's the wrong thing? It can be expensive if you're going straight into it and making ambitious targets. But businesses have kind of got away with it for a long time, not having to do it and not having to think about essentially this carbon tax. So the sooner that there is a clear guideline for what companies have to offset, the sooner that they can start actually working towards that and factoring that into their business decisions and decarbonising. Because if you've got a huge footprint, the best way you're either going to have to pay for that all in offsets, which is going to be expensive. But the best way to make sure that your bill is lower is to look at all of those business activities that you're doing and reduce, kind of decarbonize and make sure that we've seen the amount of flight, kind of imagine 2019 business receipts for flights versus 2020. There's going to be people in finance department saying, well, we've kind of survived this year on Zoom. If we could just make sure everyone's got a really good screen and a good Wi-Fi connection, suddenly we've saved tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. But also, if you then work out what the footprint of those 100 flights a year for these companies, if they were to be offsetting those, then they would have been paying a lot more as well. So there's double saving because you're not paying for the flights and then you're not paying for the offset. So it's going to be aligned for the pockets of these.
As a company, then when these numbers need to be included in either end of year reports, etc., then you ultimately, they're reducing there and they're making moves towards that. So it's a real social factor as well, isn't it? So it's all well and good people saying slating carbon offset, but it's definitely a means and a measure for companies then to right some of their wrongs, but also have some sort of social awareness to what they're doing, and try and like you said, reduce it from source. So if Zoom's working, no need to fly, and no need to fly, you've not generated useless tons of carbon. And with that, hopefully when the line is drawn, who do you think is going to be responsible for enforcing companies to do so? Do you think it's very much going to come down to a government body, or do you think it's somewhat going to be private, because everything needs to be monetized in some factor, doesn't it, and funded? So how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I don't know. It would be really interesting to see who is kind of keeping tabs on who is making net zero statements, because it'll still be a voluntary market. Companies don't have to do anything at all, but it'll be the companies who are saying we're going to be net zero who is keeping tabs on those companies. And I wish I knew, but I don't know. But I hope there is a body that comes, that maybe there's a body that I don't know about that will be kind of put in place. There's already plans to do that, but I don't know. But it'll be really important. But I'm hoping there'll also be a level of kind of self-regulation in terms of customers, and where with the world of social media, you can't get away with anything these days, which is brilliant from this aspect, because if you're a company and you're suddenly, I think there was a scandal recently that there was a company buying dubious offsets from the other side of the world, that just people had done their own research and found out that project wasn't doing what it was going to be doing. Whereas I think that the pollutant was in Australia and they were buying their offsets from thousands of miles away. People found out about that, so there was the kind of the self-regulatory social media scandal around that. But in terms of the net zero statements, I don't know who's going to be keeping tabs, but it'll be I would imagine, because there's a lot of kind of consultants around who are going to be giving their seal of approval to people's net zero missions, and through their carbon reporting, and are going to need to give that stamp that someone is net zero. So there will hopefully be a kind of a regulatory board through the consultants and anyone giving that seal of approval for a company's net zero statement, to make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're doing.
Yeah, nice. I've seen firsthand the wrath of the Twitter police sometimes, and I think they're quite a force to be reckoned with. So they're definitely when media now. You can get called out and humiliated essentially as a company through saying things, because the power of the internet now. If you're making certain claims, etc., and somebody decides to invest some time into looking what you've been doing, it doesn't take long to be called out there. And I suppose the final question for myself, and something I'd love to know, in recent times since you've been there, head of partnerships, and obviously speaking to people firsthand, how are you finding the adoption, and how are you finding that the whole concept now of carbon offset being adopted by some of the large companies you're talking to?
Yeah, well, it's a real change between smaller companies who are now, so you've got a lot of kind of 5, 10, 15 person companies where there's a lot more flexibility, and they're a lot more nimble to start integrating carbon offsetting into their business processes, and their footprint is a lot lower. So it's really pleasing to see the amount of businesses who are getting in touch with us just to find out look, we want to start this journey, we don't know how. And for us, we're typically an end point of that journey once someone knows their footprint. So we put them in touch with consultants who can kind of take them through that whole journey. But it's really pleasing to see the amount of small and medium companies that are coming to us because they see us and they come to us for some guidance. But yeah, as I said, we typically then point them in the direction of consultants who can manage that whole journey, work out what their footprint is, and then it gets a lot more challenging when you're a huge company that hasn't been doing this, and you realize when you look at the amount of companies in kind of any industry, but look at fast fashion, where the footprint is going to be is absolutely ginormous, the footprint that they've got, and they've never even really considered more than an element of lip service prior to the last kind of 5 years or so what their carbon footprint is. And there's going to be a huge challenge if net zero is implemented across major companies and they have to do this. There's going to be companies that go under, because essentially if you're adding a carbon tax onto the product of onto the business model of these companies who are creating clothing for £2, £3, £5 a t-shirt, if suddenly you're putting the carbon tax on top of these activities, it's going to make their products, they're going to have to pass the kind of costs on somewhere. So there's going to be a lot of challenges over the next few years for companies who have been kind of getting away with it without absorbing the costs of the damage that they're doing to the environment, which in the long run, it's what's needed. There's companies out there who are just trying to work out where they're doing it, but the way we see it, that there are going to be companies who are going to struggle and go under because their business model, due to the devastating effects that it has on the environment, they can't exist without that impact, and the costs will be extremely high for them to offset. But yeah, there's a lot of those companies who are trying really hard to find a solution. It's going to be challenging, but it's really pleasing to see the amount of companies who are voluntarily coming to us and entering into the market and trying to do it the right way. And if you're at a stage now where you can really start to look at it thoroughly and understand what that full footprint is, so a consultant will take you through that, understand what that full range of scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are at your company, and then you can really put a plan together to say, look, if we're going to survive in 5 years time, or in 10 years time, if we want to be here, we've got to reduce, because otherwise our offset bill is going to be huge. And then we can start factoring that into their business model, because it's another tax that should be present in every business.
Yeah, definitely. And if somebody's listening now, a business owner, and up until this point they thought it's a hugely complex factor and something where, quite simply, they don't know where to start, what would you suggest for them? Is it very much a simple case of getting in touch with yourself or one of the guys at the Future Forest Company and simply having a conversation about what they're doing and where they want to be?
Yeah, we're more than happy to have a chat. I'd say the experts will more sit with your net zero consultant. So if you're a business just starting out on this journey, the best thing you could do is understand what your footprint is and speak to a net zero consultant. So you've got some that you'll have specialists for different industries, and they will take you through kind of a bit of research. They'll ask you about different kind of a lot of data about your company over the last few years, and then you'll work out what your baseline is. So you'll take a baseline of, okay, 2019 baseline, what were our offsets then? And then that will help you understand, wow, our factories, or Jesus, we're flying a lot, we need to bring that down. So that'll give you that understanding and that knowledge to start with, because the more knowledge you have about the whole impact of your business, then you can set a target, and then you can bring it down and you can put a plan together. So you've got to be informed. It will be a long journey, and it's not always the cheapest journey with a net zero consultant. But in the long run, if your footprint in 5 years' time is double what it could be if you're not decarbonising, that will cost you more, and that will cost the environment a huge amount more in terms of the damage you'll be doing. So the best thing to do now is get in touch with a consultant. Google will help you out with that. I wouldn't want to point anyone in the direction of anyone in particular, but there's a good bunch of consultants out there who can start that educational piece, and then you can put the right solid steps in place to start reducing your footprint as well, and then offset based on the timelines that you want to put in place.
Amazing. Chris, been an absolute pleasure having you on today, and thanks very much for taking the time out of a very busy day, since I know
No,
you're
thank you, Charles.
growing in the UK but US as well. So yeah, been great to have you on, and thanks very much for not only educating me and dispelling some of the rumors that I've previously heard, but ultimately giving me a better awareness of good partners out there for carbon offset. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Charles.